Thank you. Welcome, everyone. I'd like to introduce our panelists. First, we've got Dr. Anthony Fries, is a data scientist with an epidemiology laboratory public health division at USAF SAM and AFRL. An evolutionary biologist by training, Tony finds himself in the middle of the precision medicine revolution in genomic analysis. His work revolves around the management of big data, and in this context, and access to data for public health purposes. Thank you, Tony, for being with us today. And then we've got Dr. David Friedenberg. He is a senior research scientist at Battelle, working in their neurotech group, doing things like brain-computer interfaces to help spinal cord injuries, which creates tons and tons of data. For example, one brain-computer interface can generate 3 million samples in 1 second. So his challenge is to make sense of that amount of data in order to make real-time decisions and then store it so that they can make better decisions over time. Thank you, Dave, for being here with us today.
Thanks for having me.
And Dr. F. Stuart Leeds is a family medicine professor at the Boonshoff School of Medicine and a staff MD.
Did y'all lose her? Or just me?
No, I did too.
At Wright's Research Study.
We lost you
Am I
for
not?
a bit there, Bridget. You're back now.
I'm back. Okay. I apologize for that interruption. I'd like to reintroduce Dr. F. Stuart Leeds. He is a family medicine professor at the Boonshoff School of Medicine and a staff MD at Wright State Physicians who relies on medical data generation for experimental design. Skip used big data to conduct a research study in partnership with Tim Crawford on medical marijuana. Using data allowed him to develop meaningful hypotheses for future clinical research. An interesting twist to Skip's story is that he worked in IT before, as he says, that it was called IT. By his admission, it was called data processing at the time. He was a programmer, a data analyst, and a software engineer years before he went to medical school. So he brings a unique perspective to data management and operational medicine because, in his words, he knows how they both think. So welcome. Thank you for being here today. I'm excited to get this conversation started. So I'm going to jump right in with our first question, which is, how do you, all three of you, how do you think healthcare could benefit from partnerships with universities and academia, and how is data management an important component of those partnerships?
I can start off.
Thank you, Dave.
Sure. I mean, partnerships are really critical for success in these areas. So for a project of any size, you really need experts in a lot of different fields to make these things be successful. So first, you need your stakeholders. So these can be the physicians, the patients, different types of researchers. You have a ton of data that's getting generated. And so you need people who know how to handle that data, how to store it, how to safely maintain it. And you need data scientists, right? So that's, I think, where a lot of us fall. And our job is to take the requirements from the experts, translate that into math, analyze the data, and then translate it back in a way that physicians or patients can get some tangible benefit from the system.
I'd just add that universities and academia tend to be able to buck the trend a little more. I guess think outside the box, be a little bit more forward thinking, because that's kind of the requirement to sort of generate new ideas, theories, and that freedom in a way can translate over into government level in terms of, I think in my landscape, I deal with assays and techniques and computational algorithms, and those tend to be generated by intense, deep thinking academic groups that have the time and energy. A lot of young people coming in and generating that brain power, and so translating that through the partnerships is, I think, where it hits home for me.
I think speaking as a clinical researcher and with a primary appointment in medical education, I look at big data as a wonderful opportunity for, the kind of work I do. I think about, as I was reading about, some of the summaries and précis about the kind of work folks on this panel and elsewhere are doing. And one of the descriptions was hypothesis agnostic approaches to research, which is anathema to me, because almost everything I do, one of the first things I tell students is make sure you have a hypothesis. And, that's a bit of a dogma. And frankly, in the age of big data, it may be a restrictive dogma that we're going to have to let go, along with a lot of the other hoary old holdovers from the 20th century, and the postmodern period of enlightenment, where we kind of figured out that we had to start thinking about science differently. But all that said, at the end of the day, big data is an opportunity for me to say, great, I have students here, I want to do research. I can skip past the very, sort of labor intensive phase of data collection, the whole experimental design part, that getting past IRBs and dealing with all the politics of human research, and say, guess what? We already have a pre-generated data set. Feel free to post hoc apply your hypotheses at will, and we'll generate some interesting research projects out of that. And then, from the point of view of operating in the academic setting, it's kind of an automatic get into jail free card, and that, hey, we're at the university and we're legit. We have legitimate questions. We have a good reason for wanting to get into this data. Let us have access to it. It hasn't been the golden ticket in every situation, but often it reduces some of the first barriers, especially where the data has some kind of proprietary or confidentiality aspects.
Okay, so given that, how do you see patient outcomes being influenced by data management in the future, and what types of partnerships would make these types of initiatives the most successful?
I can sort of jump in here. I think just establishing the partnerships to begin with. I'm relatively new here at AFRL, and probably half of my time is spent conveying to partners and collaborators outside of AFRL the restrictions, regulations, agreements, sort of methodological steps you have to go through and the hoops you have to jump through in order to be able to collaborate. And I think establishing the partnership at any level, just to sort of get those movements out of the way in a setting like this, is fantastic. And so that we can get to a point where we're talking about, my whole world revolves around COVID right now. So I think of COVID obviously as a clinical outcome here, and the vaccine trials that are going on, and some of the data that we generate goes directly into measuring that efficacy of a new vaccine or a new treatment. And so I think the partnerships at both an academic and industry level, and integrating those works into our own workflows could influence something like the COVID vaccine trials like we're doing right now. And so, we generate genome sequences, for instance, daily on coronaviruses. And that data needs to be put out into the public across all industry, government, and academia, in order to be able to digest those data and interpret it to see what the meaning is on a larger level. And so I think of when Skip mentions data agnostic, that's exactly the way public health, I think a data agnostic or a hypothesis agnostic approach is essentially public health. We are trying to mine as much data as possible, and data specifically here to sort of convert that into some sort of information that could be conveyed for operational medicine. And so I hope that gets to something with of your question, but I think of every data point I generate here every day going out into a larger, potentially I have no idea what it might go to for somebody else, but somebody like Skip or Dave sitting at in another institution being able to interpret that in real time.
So I don't know if this is going to end up leading to one of Bridget's next questions about the difference between data and information. Is this a good time to, should we wait and segue on that?
No, absolutely. Go for it. Thank you.
Yeah. So this is something that, so I was involved in a medical software startup. I was a founder for a company that was looking at ways to operationalize PMP data, right? PDMP or ORS in the case of Ohio. So when they first, when the programmers gave me the first run of a potential product, put it before me and said, would you use this as a physician? My initial comment was, this looks like it was designed by two IT guys and a nurse. And so what I meant by that was that I was being given data, not information. And so, and coming from the IT world, or the proto IT, the IT world, I knew how much, how in love we were with crowding screens with as much data as possible and kind of showing off what we could, give, people in terms of the potential of the technology. Maybe that might be a bit of a characterization, but you get the idea. I remember seeing the world that way. But as a physician, I'm interested in data that allows me to make a decision. So for me, the distinction, and this might even go back to like sort of, you IT guys probably know who Claude Shannon is, and it's sort of this idea of information just being sort of the opposite of entropy, or an ordering principle upon entropy. It's for me, it's about whatever's in front of me, can I make a decision? Can I decide on a treatment? Can I refine a differential diagnosis? Do I know what test I'm going to order, right? And so if you're not presenting information to me in a way that I can make a decision, then all you're doing is fatiguing me with data. And I think that is a disconnect between the world of data scientists and the world of clinicians. And which has made me want to say, put doctors in charge of the structural design of these systems. But then again, we don't have the technical expertise and competence to do it. So finding people who can think synthetically across those two very different, philosophically, I think, different branches of greater science is what needs to happen. We need data scientists who can think like clinicians and clinicians who can think like data scientists. Ultimately, I want to see its sensitivity and specificity. I want to see exactly what I need to make the decision and nothing else, right? The clean, completely refined, both sensitive and specific for the decision-making process.
Yeah, and I'll jump on top of what Skip said. You said, what patient outcomes do you see data addressing? And I think ultimately we'd like to get to a point where, we have personalized medicine, where if I come in and I have a certain set of characteristics, I can compare the doctor can get a comparison of, here's a bunch of people. I might have a disease that doctor's never even seen before, but across a large population, maybe there are people like me who they've seen and can give that doctor the information to help with some of those difficult diagnoses. It's also things like not treating to the average, but treating to the individual, right? So if you can see that patients with my characteristics maybe don't respond well to the drug that's sort of the textbook first drug to try, maybe you can bypass that and say, I think for this particular individual, the data is telling me that this might be a better treatment option, even though it's not necessarily the default option. So I think that personalized medicine is, and to Skip's point, right? It's not just having that data, it's being able to put it into an actionable format where the doctor can say, hey, this data is actually assisting me. It's actually making my decisions better, as opposed to just giving me a bunch of overwhelming information that I don't really know what to do with.
So how do you, the things like machine learning and decoding data, how do those support this idea that we've got tons of data, and we need to translate it into useful information. Do you see this machine learning changing the way that algorithms are developed, or deciding which information, which data is useful information? Do you see that currently? Do you see that being something in the future?
Yes. So,
Okay.
Machine learning is definitely allowing us to make sense of data streams that are really orders of magnitude larger than what we were capable of handling, even a decade or two ago. So they're incredibly powerful tools. We've also seen if they're not used carefully, the results can be catastrophic. So there's, examples of chatbots who, quickly start saying offensive things, or computer vision algorithms that don't pick up people of color appropriately, things like that. But when used appropriately, they're incredibly powerful tools. So, the example of the project that I work on, we have an individual with a spinal cord injury. We implanted a brain-computer interface chip in his brain. We read out 3 million data points a second. No human can look at 3 million data points a second and do anything with it, right? It's like the Matrix, where there's just all these numbers streaming. But our machine learning algorithms can take that data and quickly convert that to say, oh, hey, this guy wants to open his hand so that he can pick up his mug. And so we can leverage those algorithms to do things that we really can't do ourselves. And so, machine learning is allowing us to make use of those data streams and generate really impressive outcomes. So, our subject's been able to use his own hand, even though it's paralyzed, using our brain-computer interface, using our sleeve, which electrically stimulates his arm. And those kinds of technologies are coming. So I think a lot of us saw Elon Musk's Neuralink presentation. There's a lot of money going into these things, and I think they're also very relevant to the military. So we're working on a project now where we're trying to build some of these brain-computer interfaces that don't require surgery, that are easier to use and less invasive. And we see those things as being things that can help give our military an advantage on the battlefield.
When I'll jump in. My machine learning is a good bit different than Dave's. When I think of machine learning, I think of statistical modeling. I think of a computer with enough processing power and cores that I can simulate something happening. So I'll take it to influenza genomes, for instance. So, there's hundreds of thousands of influenza genomes out there that are publicly available that you can pull down, and you're just looking at a screen of a lot of letters. But what we've been able to sort of leverage with AWS and some other computational resources here within DoD is to simulate evolutionary principles of influenza and apply new data from a clinical outcome, say somebody showing presenting with an influenza-like illness that has symptomologies that hadn't really been seen before. You can apply that. What would have taken back in my graduate school days, which wasn't too long ago, would have taken weeks to generate some sort of discernible interpretation from a visualization of the relationship of genomes. And you can apply metadata to that, such as symptomology on a tree, and be able to interpret that now in hours and not weeks anymore. And so as an evolutionary biologist, public health, epi, that's really what it comes down to for me, is the idea of machine learning and having ultimately the user is still providing how the machine should respond. That's my experience. Dave probably has some way to teach the computer in a much more elegant way, but I'm still ultimately the one telling the computer how to react and think. And that's where I think it gets to Skip's point, where you need to interface with those people who can understand it at the interface level of a clinician and a patient to be able to interpret what results are coming out.
That's a little more GoFi than it is machine learning, right, David? I mean, that's right, good old-fashioned AI, where human beings actually impose structural theses and hypotheses onto the processing network, so that it's not just the machine learning from sort of random outcomes of processing large amounts of data. but anyway, I mean, I think most AI specialists, and I'm a dilettante about this. I want to say I read a lot about AI, but I don't work in the area. So please take everything that I say with a bit of a dilettantish grain of salt. But I'm very interested in it, and I think that most AI specialists, my nephew works at Uber in the autonomous vehicle department as he's one of the people trying to make cars drive themselves. And he keeps me regularly updated on things like TensorFlow and his little experiments with the Google Brain products and so forth. Anyway, so I have two thoughts about it, and especially if we're going to be here at a military, military/business conference, and we're going to talk about AI. I am going to be a little bit of the Cassandra here because somebody has to be. We're all very sanguine about the potential of AI and all the good things it's going to do for us. And so I think that's actually true. So I want to say, first of all, I'm beginning with the presumptions most of us are making, which are a lot of good can come out of this. And some things, frankly, are probably impossible without machine learning approaches, at David's work being an example. So two things. One is I work in the area of differential diagnosis too. And this is probably my greatest passion in my research work, is understanding, using a heuristics approach to teaching differential diagnosis to medical students and to physicians. And so I've read a little bit about how, where we are with AI in terms of differential diagnosis. And one of the things I think is still a limitation is that we're still kind of looking at that process as we have a large amount of data, right? Lots of symptomatology and lots of lots of potential diagnoses and a lot of cases ideally to review. And then we'll let machine learning kind of figure that out just by brute force cybernetics, right? The problem is that differential diagnosis, and we're about to publish a paper with this in the Journal of Medical Philosophy, I hope, is that differential diagnosis is a dialectic process for the human, which means that they have to have an initial differential diagnosis when they go into the clinical situation, and then that differential is evolved dialectically as a iterative process as you go. And so you don't generate the data set without the physician at every step sort of contributing to that process. And certainly a machine could do it too. But if you take the idea that we're just going to do this as a big data approach, you miss all of those iterations on the way to developing the data. In fact, differential diagnosis in the 80s even was taught in the way that I just described. Like you would hear the whole case, and then at the end, you would come up with a differential, when in fact, a working physician has a working differential that is being dialectically developed with every question they ask, with every exam maneuver, with every lab and study they order. So I think we're going to have to get a lot more clever about how AI works in a setting like that. Your data collection is going to have to happen kind of live, right? Secondly, I feel obligated, having read Nick Bostrom and Max Tegmark and the like, to warn everybody about problems like instrumental convergence and the paperclip problem, and what happens when we let the AI run too long without any safeguards, because we're so sure of its goodwill and intentions towards us all. I don't believe in the Skynet scenario. I'm not talking about Terminator robots stalking the hinterlands. I'm talking about a machine that wakes up one day and decides it has, the singularity, right? Decides it has an agenda of its own. I mean, I think if you believe in the power of AI, if you believe in the power of machine learning, you have to accept the potential of that as well. That's how powerful a technology it is. So, all right, not to drop that little bomb on everybody, but I felt like that needed to be said just to temper our enthusiasm a little.
So building on that a little bit, so if we look forward, how can partnerships, specifically looking at what Skip was saying, having operational medicine clinicians as the focus, how do we bridge this gap between tons of data and useful information in a way that supports operational medicine moving forward?
But I mean, these partnerships are really critical. So I'll give you an example of one that's maybe not cutting edge AI, but is really making an impact out there. So around February, March, when COVID was just kicking up, we had a Battelle engineer whose wife is works at a local hospital. And she was saying how they're starting to get ready. They don't have a lot of cases yet, but they're really worried that they're not going to have enough PPE to deal with the surge, right? And he went back and said, hey, you know what? FDA funded us a couple years ago to do this study on decontaminating masks, right? And within a matter of weeks, that sort of little partnership connection, right? It happened that you know, this was a partnership. They were husband and wife, but that spawned a relationship between Battelle, between a lot of local healthcare systems, between FDA, you know, the entire force of the government got behind it. And we fielded a bunch of these, we call CCDS, they're critical care decontamination systems. And these are basically systems that can decontaminate thousands of N95 masks very quickly and get them back into circulation, right? And so those things don't happen unless you have, you know, the engineering and the scientific expertise to actually build the things. And then you have the actual expertise to like assemble those and make them work at scale, right? So this was something that we did in the lab, and all of a sudden now it's going on in a shipping container so that we can move it between, you know, hospital to hospital. It requires a lot of expertise from the government to identify these things, to help expedite getting them all the appropriate FDA approvals. You know, and then it goes back to, you know, the original scientific funding that's saying like, hey, you know, this is a problem. And they weren't thinking specifically of COVID-19. It didn't even exist when that research was initiated. But, you know, all those things have to come together. And there's a big data component there too, right? So we have to keep track of all these different N95 masks. And, you know, if I'm a doctor at one hospital, I want to get my same mask back. And so how do you do that? How do you keep track of all those different things when you're trying to process as many masks as fast as you possibly can? And so that's an area where, you know, maybe that's one where it's not a crazy AI solution to something, but where having that data management component and being able to spin that up quickly and execute on that, you know, is something that's, you know, potentially saving lives. It's getting healthcare workers, you know, N95 masks that they might not have otherwise. So, you know, I think almost all projects of that scale require really carefully thought out and well executed partnerships.
I'd just like to really echo that point that David just mentioned with data science and AI does not equal data management. And so it gets so blown out of the potential and what opportunities are there with AI that every day I deal with a lot of data points that ultimately all I'm trying to do is visualize it or put it into context for somebody to draw information from and hopefully develop knowledge from that information. And so where those partnerships come in, and I think COVID has driven this to the extreme and sort of forced everything out into the open. That Battelle instance, I remember reading those stories right when it happened. It was the most fascinating sort of generation of an idea there and linking. And those partnerships obviously connect that network together and allow us to make those conclusions. But I think where partnerships help me the most is having somebody from industry reach out and say that, have you thought about this, or have you thought about displaying information this way? And so with COVID, we've had to completely think about supply chains from a public health laboratory perspective, you know, and how to manage supply chains. How do we keep track of supply chains? We're getting data points every single day about how things are moving around within our lab. But when a commander in the AFRL side of things needs to make a decision on what to purchase or what to deploy in a certain setting overseas for operational medicine, ultimately it comes down to these data points that are generated every day that need to be translated very quickly. And I rely on those partnerships like in software more so than anything else. I mean, I could generate my own scripts and pipelines to spit out data, but likely somebody has already developed that wheel and I don't have to recreate it. And the sharing of that information with COVID, for instance, has sort of democratized and sort of made higher ups and lay people outside of data science realize that simple things, just like a supply chain, not machine learning, not telling the brain how to operate, just understanding what to purchase or how to isolate or quarantine a specific individual comes down to a data point and inferring and visualizing that information for leaders.
Well, we're all in silos, right? I mean, I'm trying to imagine a scenario where I would have met either Tony or David here to talk about anything like this. Obviously, events like this are opportunities to cross-cut, and that's great, but they're sort of one-offs, right? You know, they're sui generis. So we, you know, maybe we need to be talking sort of in meta terms, like maybe we need AI to be connecting us, like being able to look at what I'm doing as my life as a data set, and Anthony is a data set, Tony is a data set, David is a data set, you as a data set, and starting to, put together what sort of syntheses might make sense here. Who should be connected with whom? COVID-19 has temporarily, in a state of exigency, has kind of temporarily reduced a whole bunch of barriers, right? Like peer review seems to have withered on the vine a little bit. It's pretty easy to get some pretty bad papers published, but also some important ones, right? And probably that whole system has been broken for a long time. Any academic will tell you that. I think certainly in my area, I'd say that's true. And it was in sore need of reform, and now it's getting it whether it likes it or not. We're going to have to rebuild at some point and figure out what we want science to look like going forward. But maybe we ought to be doing it in the sense of the silos need to come down. Like, enough of this already. I need to be talking to people like you. I am, that my interest in differential diagnosis is such that, I've gone to a couple meetings where I've run into people who are doing, in fact, one guy was an AI researcher doing patient simulations to teach students. And he's like, wow, I heard your stuff. And it's like, I want to operationalize your heuristics. I had no idea that people were approaching differential diagnosis this way. And I had published on it, but it's not journals he read, And so there we were. And it was just a random meeting. And I think, wow, that's how many of those random meetings aren't happening, right? So maybe we ought to be actually researching the research here and on a meta level, figuring out how to bring the walls down.
Thank you, Skip. First of all, I want to say thank you to WBI for creating these collisions today, right? And so creating these conversations, bringing people together, just like that you were talking about, Skip, that to have these conversations, and let's continue them. So I have a few questions from the audience. Our first is from Robert McClendon. He says, ultimately, who decides what quote unquote clean data is propagated to the end user? What are the checks and balances, and how do we maintain the validity of the data over time, specifically with respect to subsequent conflicting data?
Interesting.
I'll start with that one. I think transparency is the key here. Clean data. I'll use Genomic World for instance. So we generate a ton of letters. Those letters can be broken out, A's, G's, and T's on so many different levels. You can tease out a microbiome. You can tease out a virus. You can tease out a host, a human genome. Being able to share those raw data with other scientists that can interpret it, ultimately, I think is where I try to maintain my integrity, because clean data to me does mean something differently to you. And being open and honest, and maybe this comes down to the peer review. I like that peer review journals lately have required data sets to be uploaded even to submit your paper for publication. Some of those preprints don't, and that's why they can sneak through and get publicized without it. But I think it's an excellent point, but validity is in the eye of the beholder. And as long as you can provide some sort of raw data set, I think that's where, I don't know how you provide David's 3 billion per second data points. That is on a whole nother landscape than myself, but I think transparency is my answer to that.
Yeah, I'd agree. There's transparency. One of the things that we've done at Patel that we've been really successful with is giving end users access to the data in formats that they can handle. So it's not necessarily, here's a ton of data files, but here's a little web interface or a little GUI that lets you, drag and drop and select different data points and see how they interact and see what changes are made. And then we can walk through and say, these are the approaches that we took to clean the data, and you can follow through those approaches, but you can also experiment, right? Because as a data scientist, I'm not an expert in neuroscience. I'm not an expert in whatever the field is. And so giving those experts, taking away a lot of the code that's behind the scenes, but giving them access to it in a way that they can understand is really helpful. And to Tony's point, like, I'm not sure that clean data actually really exists in the real world, right? There's always, is it clean enough to do what I need to do with it? And so those are other kinds of tools where, once you can start visualizing things and looking at them and sharing that information with the team, that's when you start to identify, like, okay, I thought this was clean, but now I'm seeing there's these other signals in here that we might want to deal with, or maybe those other signals are there and we can just ignore them or work around them. So yeah, outside of textbooks, there's very, very few real world data sets that I think ever get to the point where you say this data set is clean.
So I'm way outside my wheelhouse with this, but there's a couple things I think I could add. One is that I think we have to take data integrity seriously as sort of a separate important subject. And it's like instead of being in love with the fact that we can generate so much data, we need to spend that much time and attention on how do we keep the data clean? How do we maintain its integrity? And maybe there's a role, again, sort of a meta thing for AI to be, machine learning our way into better data integrity as well as in processing that data. I also think about Nicholas Taleb, and for those of you who've read Anti-Fragile or The Black Swan, for that matter, great books, problematic books probably, but great in their own right. And this idea of constructive redundancy, nature has figured out, not perfectly, but certainly has figured out mechanisms for maintaining data integrity, right? So we have, various kinds of, topoisomerases and different DNA enzymes to sort of, and DNA being a very stable molecule against RNA and all of that is ways nature has figured out to not let, generation loss and other data problems become an issue. And obviously it's imperfect because we have cancer and we have genetic diseases and so forth. But we also have the human race, which has done pretty well for 150,000 years or so, 75 to 150. So how does it do it? It does it by constructive redundancy. It does it by having multiple backups. It does it by eschewing efficiency, in fact, in favor of a certain amount of redundancy because data integrity is that important. So I think we have to make it consciously that important too.
So we have a number more questions that I don't think we're going to get to today. We've only got a little bit of time left. So what I'd like to do, if we have time after this round, we'll go to another question. But what I'd like to do is if each of you could let the audience know how they potentially could get in touch with you. And maybe quickly, what kind of partnerships are you personally looking for right now? So if there's anybody that's listening right now who meets that and would love to have a conversation with you, how would they go about doing that? So if each of you could take a few minutes and give us that information, that would be helpful.
Sure. Patel has a website, patel.org. You can find out all about us there. We also are going to be having an exhibit later today, so I'll be in there with some of my colleagues. Feel free to stop by and say hi. We can exchange info there. If you want to get in touch with me personally, LinkedIn, David Friedenberg.
If you go to Wright.edu, and if you just put in Wright State University Leeds, you'll go right to my people page. Probably the quickest way to get in touch with me directly. My cleanest email box is fstewart.leeds@wright.edu. That's Stewart with a U, FSTUART.LEEDS @wright.edu.
Yeah, I'd say LinkedIn. I'll be in the booth later on during the expo. Insofar as what partnerships I'd be looking for, I don't know. I have limited bandwidth to, I don't want to say to think, but that's what I miss about graduate school. And I was just talking with somebody who's going through their doctoral program, and I said, just enjoy reading. Just enjoy being able to deep think about anything. It doesn't have to even relate to your career field or your discipline. But I in the few years that I've been here, I've relied on others to bring me the thought and translating their data into information that I can draw knowledge from. And so, I'm interested in visualizations. I'm interested in interpretation and taking data to a level that's appreciable to, hundreds of different consumers. And so I guess if anybody has any of those concepts, I'm not, there's lots of great AFR. Keep getting it out there.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that, because I think I skipped that second part of your question.
Yeah.
We're interested in sort of all sorts of collaborations, government, academic, industry. We like solving hard problems, and usually the hardest problems, as we've found out today, right, require collaborations and organizing teams that go across lots of different disciplines and have lots of different perspectives. So if anyone has any of those kinds of problems, we'd love to hear about them.
Good problems to have. So I'm probably the most eclectic of the group here, and that's why I love what I do. And in family medicine, nobody can ever say no to me, really, but anything I'm interested in. So almost everything's fair game. My research interests include, as I mentioned, differential diagnosis. That's probably my chief impetus and passion right now, is figuring out how to teach people differential diagnosis, models for differential diagnosis. I'm very interested in operationalizing it in the AI world. If somebody is approaching it in a way that I think is more than, approaching it like a clinician would instead of a data scientist. Or would like to cross that bridge somehow. I also do, as you mentioned, Bridget, I do work with medical marijuana, and that's where I've been working on a particularly interesting big data set in lieu of clinical trials right now, because those are so hard to do with marijuana being Schedule 1. So it's actually sort of probably the golden era until the DEA scheduling changes. Marijuana research involving big data is probably the way to go. So I'm definitely interested in that. And then I also do research, medical education flavored research into chronic pain management and fibromyalgia. And I publish across all of those things, and nobody can tell me I can't, so I do. So.
Well, thank you. We have 2 minutes, so I'm going to reach in and throw one more question out. We'll probably only have time for one of you to answer the question, but we'll throw it out there. So this is from Jim Andrews. He asks, I've seen a lot of AI/machine learning approaches and projects, but what many lack is an application, actionable information, or a product for the warfighter. How can we formulate AI/machine learning appropriately to move into the applied stage more often and support the warfighter? Who wants to take that one?
I'm out.
All right, Skip.
No, that was I'm out.
You're out. Okay.
I'm tapping out. Yeah. So yeah.
Yeah, I can try.
Okay.
I think these kinds of events are really helpful. A lot of times it's just making those connections, like understanding, with really great specificity and precision, like what are the biggest problems? What do the data sets look like? What are the operational constraints? Because there's always tons of operational constraints. And then figuring out, what are the right mechanisms for us to be able to collaborate and work together. So I think these are great events for helping to make those collisions happen and helping to interact the people who can bring some of these MLAI solutions with the people who need them but don't have the MLAI component. And so, like I said, if there are specific applications, stop by the exhibition, and we'd love to talk about them.
Well, that's our time for today. I want to thank all of you for being on the panel. This was informative and entertaining, so thank you for your time. I also want to thank those of you who tuned in and contributed questions. We didn't get to all of them. I apologize for that, but our panelists have given you ways to get in touch with them. Do that, reach out. Let's continue these conversations. And again, a big thanks to WBI for creating these opportunities for the collisions. And I'm going to turn it back over to them.